What if the person who taught you strength was also the one who quietly broke you first? For years, the world watched Tamar Braxton and thought they understood her. The loud reactions, the emotional arguments, the dramatic moments that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. On television, it looked like personality. Tamar was labeled the outspoken one, the unpredictable one, the sister who always took things too far. But now Tamar is telling a story that starts long before the cameras ever rolled. And at the center of that story is the woman many viewers believed was the steady foundation of the entire family, Evelyn Braxton. According to Tamar, the pressure she lived under didn't begin on reality TV. It began at home. She suggests the criticism, the expectations, and the emotional tension were part of a pattern that lasted for years. A pattern where love sometimes came with conditions, and where speaking up often made her the problem. So the real question isn't why Tamar reacted the way she did. The real question is, what was she reacting to all along? Long before the cameras, the interviews, and the reality television drama, the Braxton household was already a place filled with strong personalities, high expectations, and complicated emotions. To the outside world, the family eventually became known for talent, humor, and unforgettable moments on Braxton family values. But according to reflections shared by Tamar Braxton, the emotional dynamics that viewers saw on screen had roots that stretched far back into childhood. In many families, roles form quietly over time. One child becomes the peacemaker. Another becomes the responsible one who rarely causes trouble. Someone else becomes the quiet observer who avoids conflict entirely. And sometimes one child becomes the one everyone watches more closely than the others. Tamar has suggested that she grew up feeling like that child. She has spoken in several interviews about how her emotions were often treated as something that needed to be corrected rather than understood. If she reacted strongly to something, the focus quickly shifted from the original situation to the way she expressed herself. Instead of asking what caused the hurt, conversations reportedly turned into discussions about whether Tamar's reaction was too intense. Over time, those conversations can shape the way a child sees themselves. When someone repeatedly hears that they are too sensitive, too dramatic, or too emotional, those labels start to stick. Even when the feelings themselves may be valid, the reaction becomes the center of attention instead of the cause. According to Tamar's reflections, this dynamic often played out within the family structure led by her mother, Evelyn Braxton. Evelyn was widely respected as a strong matriarch who raised 6 children while navigating major life challenges, including the end of her marriage to Michael Conrad Braxton Sr. She was known for her discipline, her faith, and her belief that her daughters needed to be tough in order to survive the world. From Evelyn's perspective, structure and correction were part of preparing her children for real life. But Tamar has hinted that the experience of that discipline sometimes felt different from inside the household. Instead of feeling guided, she says she often felt evaluated. There were expectations about how the girls should behave, how they should present themselves publicly, and how they should handle conflict. Respect for authority was emphasized strongly, and challenging that authority could create tension. For Tamar, this sometimes created a situation where expressing hurt could be interpreted as disrespect rather than vulnerability. When those moments happen repeatedly during childhood, they can shape emotional habits that last for years. A child may begin to react louder because quieter attempts to be heard never seem to work, or they may become defensive because they expect their feelings to be dismissed. Tamar has suggested that many of the reactions viewers later saw on television were influenced by those early experiences, but when the family entered the entertainment industry, the emotional dynamics inside the household became even more complicated. The Braxton sisters had always been connected through music. Long before reality television made them household names, they had performed together and supported one another's careers. The most famous breakout star from the family was Toni Braxton, whose powerful voice turned her into one of the best-selling R&B artists of her generation. Her success brought the family into the spotlight. But success can create pressure just as easily as opportunity. As the sisters navigated careers, personal lives, and public attention, the emotional dynamics between them became more visible. Sibling relationships are naturally complicated, especially when personalities are very different. Some people communicate calmly during conflict, while others express themselves more openly and passionately. Tamar has always been known for her big personality. She is quick with humor, expressive with her feelings, and rarely afraid to speak her mind. For audiences, that personality often came across as entertaining and unpredictable at the same time. But inside the family, that same personality sometimes placed Tamar in a difficult position. According to her perspective, whenever conflict happened, her reactions often became the main focus. Even when she felt she was responding to something that hurt her, the conversation could quickly shift to how she reacted rather than why she reacted. This pattern eventually became extremely visible once Braxton Family Values premiered in 2011. Reality television thrives on emotional storytelling. Producers look for moments of tension, strong personalities, and conflicts that can keep viewers engaged. Tamar's expressive reactions naturally became a central part of the show's narrative. Episodes frequently highlighted her arguments with her sisters, emotional breakdowns, and passionate responses during family meetings. To many viewers, those moments created the impression that Tamar was simply the dramatic member of the family. But Tamar has since suggested that what people saw on screen often lacked the full context. Reality television rarely shows every conversation that leads up to a reaction. Small comments, unresolved frustrations, and subtle emotional triggers can build quietly before a scene finally explodes into conflict. When only the reaction is shown, the reaction becomes the story. According to Tamar, watching those episodes back later felt deeply unsettling. Moments that felt painful in real life were turned into dramatic entertainment for millions of viewers. She has described how strange it felt to see scenes where she was clearly hurt edited into segments meant to be humorous or shocking. Laughter from audiences sometimes replaced the concern she wished people had felt in those moments. That experience slowly shaped the public narrative around her personality. Viewers began to associate Tamar with chaos and emotional volatility. Social media commentary reinforced that perception, often describing her as the sister who couldn't control her emotions. But Tamar has suggested that those reactions may have been misunderstood. Instead of being random emotional outbursts, she believes many of them were responses to deeper family patterns that had existed long before the cameras arrived. At the center of those patterns was the relationship between Tamar and her mother. Evelyn Braxton was often portrayed on the show as the wise matriarch who guided her daughters through conflicts. Her calm demeanor and strong faith gave her an image of stability that audiences respected. But Tamar has hinted that their relationship behind the scenes could be more complicated. She has suggested that her mother's words often carried enormous influence within the family. When Evelyn labeled a situation a certain way, that perspective often shaped how others responded. If Tamar was described as emotional or dramatic, the conversation sometimes followed that interpretation rather than exploring the reasons behind her feelings. This dynamic created a cycle that Tamar found difficult to escape. The more emotional she became while trying to defend herself, the more people pointed to that emotion as proof that she was the problem. Each attempt to explain herself seemed to reinforce the same narrative. And when millions of viewers are watching those moments on television, the pressure becomes even heavier. Tamar has said that the cameras didn't create the tension inside the family.
Tamar has
They
always
simply
been known
exposed
for her
it.
big personality.
For audiences,
She is
the
quick with
conflicts
humor,
were entertainment.
expressive with her feelings,
For the family
and rarely
members
afraid
living
to
through
speak her
them,
mind.
those moments carried
For
real
audiences,
emotional consequences.
that personality often
Over
came
time,
across as
Tamar
entertaining
began
and
to realize
unpredictable
that
at the same
constantly
time.
trying to prove she
But
wasn't the
inside
problem was
family,
exhausting.
That same personality
Every argument
sometimes
felt
placed
like
Tamar
another
in a
opportunity
difficult
for the
position.
same labels to be
According
repeated.
to her perspective,
Too
whenever
emotional,
conflict happened,
too
her
reactive,
reactions often became the main
too
focus.
dramatic.
Even
But the
when she
deeper
felt
question
was
she
responding to
eventually
something that
began
hurt her,
asking herself
the
was different.
conversation could quickly shift
Instead
to
of
how
wondering
she
why
reacted
she
rather
felt
than
so
why she
strongly,
reacted.
she started wondering
This
why her
pattern eventually
feelings were
became
always
extremely
treated as the
visible once
issue.
Braxton Family
That
Values
shift in
premiered
perspective
in
didn't happen
2011.
overnight.
Reality
It took years of
television
reflection,
thrives on emotional
distance from the show,
storytelling.
and conversations that
Producers
forced
look for
Tamar
moments
to
of
look
tension,
back at her
strong
childhood with new
personalities,
clarity.
and conflicts
And
that
once
can
she
keep
started
viewers
seeing
engaged.
those patterns, the
Tamar's
past began to
expressive
look very
reactions
different from the
naturally
way it
became a
once
central
had.
part of the show's narrative.
Because sometimes the person who is
Episodes
labeled the
frequently
problem in a
highlighted her
family
arguments
is
with her
actually the
sisters,
one reacting to
emotional
something no
breakdowns,
one else
and
wants to
passionate
acknowledge.
responses during family meetings.
And if Tamar's interpretation
To many
is
viewers,
even partly
those
true,
moments created
then the
the
emotional
impression
moments
that Tamar
that
was simply
audiences
the dramatic
laughed at
member
or
of the family.
criticized may have been something
But
else
Tamar has
entirely.
since suggested that what
They may
people
have
saw
been
on screen
signals,
often lacked the full context.
signals that something deeper
Reality
was happening
television
beneath the
rarely
surface
shows
of a
every
family that the
conversation
world
that
believed
leads
it
up to a
already
reaction.
understood. As
Small
the years
comments,
passed and the
unresolved
cameras kept
frustrations,
rolling on
and
Braxton
subtle
family
emotional
values,
triggers can
the
build
emotional
quietly
patterns
before a scene
inside the
finally
Braxton
explodes
family
into
didn't
conflict.
simply disappear.
When only the
If
reaction
anything,
is shown,
they became
the
more
reaction
visible.
becomes the story.
For viewers, the
According
show
to
was a
Tamar,
window into a
watching
family
those
that felt
episodes
real,
back later felt
unpredictable,
deeply
and
unsettling.
at times chaotic.
Moments that
But
felt
for Tamar
painful in real
Braxton,
life
the
were
experience
turned into
reportedly
dramatic
felt like
entertainment
living
for
inside
millions
a
of
cycle
viewers.
that kept repeating
She has
itself.
described how strange
Reality
it felt to see
television
scenes
has a way of
where she was
shaping
clearly
narratives.
hurt, edited into segments
Once producers
meant to be
and
humorous
audiences
or
latch
shocking.
onto a certain
Laughter
storyline,
from audiences
everything that follows
sometimes
tends
replaced
to
the
reinforce
concern
it.
she wished people had
Tamar's
felt in
expressive
those moments.
personality quickly
That
became one of the
experience
defining
slowly shaped
elements of the
public
series.
narrative around her
Her
personality.
reactions were dramatic,
Viewers
her
began
humor
to
was sharp,
associate Tamar
and her
with
emotional
chaos
responses
and
were
emotional
impossible to
volatility.
ignore. But
Social
Tamar
media
has
commentary
suggested that the
reinforced
editing and
perception,
structure of
often
reality
describing her
television
as the
sometimes
sister who
simplified
couldn't
what was
control her
actually
emotions.
happening. When
But Tamar
conflicts
has
appeared on
suggested that
screen,
those reactions
viewers
may
often
have
saw
been
Tamar
misunderstood.
reacting loudly while the
Instead
rest of the
being
room
random
appeared
emotional
calmer in
outbursts,
comparison.
She believes many
The
of them
image
were
was
responses
powerful.
to deeper family patterns
It created a
that had
clear
existed long
contrast
before
that
the
made
cameras
Tamar
arrived.
stand out in
At the
almost
center
every
of
heated
those
moment.
patterns was the relationship
What
between
audiences
Tamar
didn't
and her mother.
always see were the quiet
Evelyn
moments
Braxton
that led up
was
to those
often portrayed
reactions.
on the show as the wise
Small
matriarch
comments that
who
might
guided
have
her
felt
daughters
dismissive.
through conflicts.
Side conversations
Her calm
that
demeanor
hinted
and
at
strong
frustration
faith gave
building
her an
behind
image
the
of
scenes.
stability that audiences
Emotional
respected.
tensions that had
But
existed
Tamar
between
has
family
hinted that
members
their
long
relationship
before
behind
filming
the
even
scenes could be
started.
more complicated.
Those details
She
rarely
has
became the
suggested
focus
that her
of an
mother's
episode.
words often carried enormous
Instead,
influence
the
within
reaction
family.
became the story.
When Evelyn labeled
And
a
once that
situation a
narrative
certain
was
way,
repeated enough
that
times,
perspective often
it became
shaped how
extremely
others
difficult
responded.
for Tamar to escape
If
the
Tamar
role
was
she had been
described as
assigned.
emotional or dramatic,
According to
the
Tamar's
conversation
reflections,
sometimes
walking into family
followed that
conversations on
interpretation,
camera
rather
sometimes
than
felt
exploring
like
the
entering a
reasons
room
behind her
where the
feelings.
outcome had already been
This
decided.
dynamic created a cycle
If she
that
raised her
Tamar
voice,
found difficult
it confirmed
to
the
escape.
expectation
The more
that she was being
emotional she
dramatic.
became while trying to defend
If she
herself,
tried to calmly
the more
explain
people pointed
herself,
to that
the
emotion
discussion
as proof
sometimes
that she was the
shifted
problem.
before her explanation was
Each
fully
attempt to
heard.
explain herself
Either
seemed
way,
to
the
reinforce
result
the same
often felt the
narrative.
same.
And when
The
millions of
spotlight
viewers
remained
are
on her
watching those
reaction.
moments on television,
Meanwhile,
the pressure
the
becomes
original
even
issue
heavier.
that triggered the emotion
Tamar has
could
said
easily
that the
fade
cameras
into the
didn't create
background.
the tension inside
This
the family.
pattern
simply
created a
exposed it.
situation where Tamar felt
For
increasingly
audiences, the
misunderstood,
conflicts were
both by
entertainment.
viewers and by some of
For
the people
family
closest to
members
her.
living through them,
The
those
person
moments
whose
carried
opinion
real
carried the
emotional
most influence
consequences.
in those conversations
Over
was
time,
often her mother,
Tamar began
Evelyn
to
Braxton.
realize that constantly
Evelyn
trying to
was
prove
widely
she wasn't
respected
the
by
problem was
fans of the show.
exhausting.
She
Every
was
argument
portrayed as
felt
the spiritual
like another
center of the
opportunity
family,
for the same
someone who
labels to be
offered
repeated.
guidance, wisdom, and
Too
prayer during
emotional.
moments of conflict. conflict.
Too reactive.
Her calm demeanor
Too
often
dramatic.
contrasted sharply
But
with the
deeper
louder
question
arguments
she
between the
eventually
sisters.
began asking herself
But
was
Tamar
different.
has hinted that their
Instead
relationship
of wondering
contained
why she
layers the
felt
public
so
didn't
strongly,
fully understand.
She started wondering why her
In Tamar's
feelings
view,
were always
her mother's
treated as the
authority
issue.
within the family sometimes
shift in
meant that her
perspective didn't
perspective
happen
shaped the
overnight.
entire conversation.
It took years of
When
reflection,
Evelyn framed
distance
Tamar's reaction as excessive or disrespectful, that interpretation could quickly become the dominant one in the room.
Once she started seeing
the discussion would then revolve around Tamar's behavior rather than the issue that caused her reaction.
Because sometimes
over time, Tamar says this created a sense of emotional isolation. Even when she believed she had a valid reason to feel hurt, the conversation often moved toward correcting her tone or her delivery. The message she began to internalize was that the problem wasn't the situation itself, it was the way she responded to it. That kind of dynamic can slowly become exhausting. When someone feels like they constantly have to defend their emotions, they may begin reacting more intensely simply because they feel unheard. Tamar has suggested that many of her most emotional moments on the show were not attempts to create drama. Instead, she believes they were the result of feeling repeatedly dismissed during conversations that mattered deeply to her. But reality television doesn't always reward nuance. Episodes need clear conflict. Storylines need recognizable characters. And Tamar's passionate reactions fit perfectly into the role of the emotional sister whose responses drove the drama forward. Meanwhile, the quieter emotional build-up behind those moments rarely received the same attention. Watching those episodes back later reportedly became a painful experience for Tamar. Moments where she felt genuinely hurt were replayed as entertainment. Scenes that represented real family conflict were edited into dramatic cliffhanger designed to keep viewers watching the next episode. Tamar has hinted that this environment reinforced the very dynamics she had struggled with for years. When millions of viewers are laughing, criticizing, or debating your reactions online, it becomes even harder to explain the deeper feelings behind those moments. Public perception can become a powerful force that overshadows personal truth. And the longer the show continued, the more firmly Tamar's public image became attached to that emotional role. Yet while viewers were watching those dramatic moments unfold, Tamar says something else was happening behind the scenes. She was beginning to question the narrative that had followed her for most of her life. For years, she had been told in various ways that she was simply too emotional, too reactive, too sensitive. Those descriptions had shaped the way others viewed her, and eventually they began shaping the way she viewed herself. But as time passed and she gained distance from the most intense moments of filming, Tamar started reconsidering those assumptions. Instead of asking why she felt so strongly, she began asking a different question. What if those emotions weren't the problem? What if they were responses to something deeper? That realization didn't come easily. It often happens slowly, through therapy, reflection, and the uncomfortable process of revisiting old memories with a new perspective. Tamar has spoken about how watching old episodes later in life felt different from experiencing them in the moment. Scenes that once filled her with embarrassment began to reveal something else. Patterns, repeated situations where she felt dismissed, conversations where her feelings were quickly reframed as attitude, moments where her attempts to explain herself ended with someone telling her to calm down instead of asking why she felt hurt. Those patterns led Tamar to start examining her childhood more closely, and that examination eventually brought her back to the earliest emotional lessons she learned inside the Braxton household. The relationship between a child and their parent is often the foundation for how that child understands love, approval, and emotional safety. Tamar has never suggested that her mother lacked love for her. In fact, she has frequently acknowledged the sacrifices Evelyn Braxton made while raising her children. But Tamar has hinted that love sometimes came with expectations that were difficult for her to meet. Respect, discipline, and obedience were emphasized strongly in the home.
It was the way
Those
she
values
responded
can
to
create
it.
structure and
That
stability,
kind of dynamic
but they can
can
also
slowly
leave
become
little space
exhausting.
for emotional vulnerability
When someone
if they are
feels like
enforced
they
without
constantly have to
flexibility.
defend their emotions,
According to
they may
Tamar's
begin
perspective,
reacting more intensely
moments when she
simply
expressed
because they
strong
feel
emotions
unheard.
were sometimes met with correction
Tamar has
instead of
suggested that
comfort.
many of her most emotional
Calm
moments
down.
on the show were not attempts
Handle
to
it
create
differently.
drama.
Don't
Instead,
embarrass the family.
She believes they were the result of
Statements
feeling
like
repeatedly
these may
dismissed
sound like
during
normal parental
conversations that
guidance,
mattered deeply to her.
but Tamar suggests
But
that
reality
hearing them
television
repeatedly can
doesn't
send a subtle
always
message
reward
to a
nuance.
child that emotional
Episodes
distress
need
is
clear
something that
conflict.
needs to be controlled rather than understood.
Storylines need recognizable
Over time,
characters.
that lesson can shape
And
the way
Tamar's
someone
passionate
expresses
reactions
pain.
fit perfectly
Instead
into
of
the role
feeling
the
safe
emotional
enough to share
sister
emotions
whose
calmly,
responses drove
they
the
may
drama
only feel
forward.
heard when their feelings
Meanwhile,
become impossible
the
to
quieter
ignore.
emotional build-up behind
That
those
pattern
moments
can
rarely
create
received
exactly
the
the
same
kind of
attention.
explosive reactions
Watching
viewers
those
later
episodes
witnessed
back
on
later
television.
reportedly became
And
a
once
painful
those
experience
reactions
for
become
Tamar.
public, the stories
Moments
surrounding
where she
them
felt
can become
genuinely
difficult to
hurt
change.
were replayed as entertainment.
By the time Tamar began
Scenes
openly
that
reflecting on
represented
these
real family
dynamics,
conflict
the
were
public had
edited into
already spent
dramatic
years forming
cliffhanger
opinions
designed
about her
to keep viewers
personality.
watching the next episode.
Some people saw her as
Tamar
entertaining
has
and
hinted
honest.
that this environment
Others saw
reinforced the
her
very
as dramatic
dynamics
or
she had
unpredictable.
struggled with for years.
But very few people
When
considered
millions
the
of viewers are
possibility
laughing,
that those emotional
criticizing,
reactions
or
might have
debating your
deeper roots
reactions
connected
online,
to family
it becomes
dynamics
even
that
harder
existed
to
long
explain the
before
deeper
reality
feelings
television.
behind those moments.
For Tamar,
Public
recognizing
perception
those
can
patterns
become a
was both
powerful
painful
force
and
that
freeing.
overshadows personal truth.
Painful because it forced
And
her
the
to
longer the show
reconsider many
continued,
moments from her
the more
past.
firmly Tamar's public
Freeing
image became
because it allowed
attached
her
to
to
that
stop
emotional
viewing
role.
herself as simply too
Yet while
much.
viewers were watching those
Instead,
dramatic moments
she began
unfold,
seeing her
Tamar
emotions
says
as signals
something
that
else
something
was
inside
happening behind
her
the
had been
scenes.
asking to be acknowledged
She
for a
was
very
beginning
long
to question
time.
the narrative
And
that
that
had followed her for
realization
most of her
was
life.
about to change the way she
For
approached
years,
her family
she had been
relationships
told
forever.
in various ways that
As
she was
time
simply
passed
too
and
emotional,
distance slowly entered the picture,
too reactive,
Tamar Braxton
too
began looking at
sensitive.
her past from a
Those
perspective she
descriptions
never
had
had
shaped
while
the
living
way others
inside
viewed
it.
her, and
For
eventually
years,
they began
every
shaping the way
disagreement
she
felt
viewed
immediate,
herself.
emotional,
But as
and
time
impossible to
passed and
fully
she gained
process.
distance from the most
But
intense
stepping
moments
away
of
from the
filming,
constant pressure
Tamar
of cameras,
started reconsidering
public
those
opinion,
assumptions.
and family expectations
Instead of asking
reportedly
why
gave
she
her
felt
something
so
she had
strongly,
rarely experienced
she began
before.
asking a different question.
Silence.
What if those
Not the
emotions
uncomfortable
weren't the problem?
silence that follows an
What if they
argument,
were
but the
responses
kind
to
of
something
quiet
deeper?
space where reflection
That
becomes possible.
realization didn't come easily.
For someone who had spent
It
so
often
much of her
happened
life
slowly,
defending her
through
emotions,
therapy,
that
reflection,
silence initially
and the
felt
uncomfortable
unfamiliar.
process of revisiting old
Tamar has
memories
hinted
with a
that
new
for a long
perspective.
time, she believed
Tamar
the
has
only way
spoken
to be
about how
understood
watching
was to
old
keep
episodes
explaining
later
herself.
in life felt different
Every
from
conversation
experiencing them
became
in the
another
moment.
attempt to prove she
Scenes
wasn't the
that once
person
filled
people
her
thought
with
she was.
embarrassment began to reveal
But over
something
time,
else.
she began to realize
Patterns.
something difficult.
Repeated situations
Explaining
where she
herself
felt
over
dismissed.
and over again wasn't changing the
Conversations where her
narrative.
feelings were quickly
If anything,
reframed as
it sometimes
attitude.
reinforced it.
Moments where her
Each
attempts
emotional
to explain
defense
herself
looked like
ended
another
with someone
reaction.
telling her to calm down
Each passionate
instead of
explanation
asking why she
could
felt
easily
hurt.
be interpreted as the
Those
very
patterns
behavior
led
she
Tamar
was trying to
start
clarify.
examining her childhood more
The
closely.
cycle seemed impossible
And
to
that
escape.
examination eventually
That
brought her back
realization
to the earliest
reportedly
emotional
marked a
lessons
turning point
she
in
learned
Tamar's
inside
personal
the
journey.
Braxton household.
Instead of trying
The
to change
relationship
how
between
everyone
a
else
child
viewed
and their
her,
parent is
she
often the
started
foundation
focusing on
for how
something
that
much
child
quieter and
understands
far
love,
more
approval, and
challenging,
emotional safety.
understanding herself.
Tamar has never suggested
Therapy
that her
became
mother
part
lacked
of
love
that
for her.
process.
In fact,
According to Tamar,
she has frequently
having a
acknowledged
space where
the
her emotions
sacrifices
weren't
Evelyn
immediately
Braxton made
corrected
while
or
raising her
redirected
children.
allowed her to examine
But Tamar has
experiences
hinted that love
she had long
sometimes
pushed
came with
aside.
expectations that were
Conversations
difficult for her
that
to meet.
once felt confusing began
Respect,
revealing
discipline,
patterns
and
she hadn't
obedience were
recognized
emphasized
before.
strongly in the home.
One of the most difficult
Those
patterns
values can
involved
create
her
structure
relationship
and
with her
stability,
mother,
but
Evelyn
they can also
Braxton.
leave little space for
Evelyn
emotional
had always been
vulnerability
seen
if they are
publicly
enforced
as the
without
spiritual
flexibility.
center of the Braxton family.
According to Tamar's perspective,
Her faith,
moments
strength,
when she
and
expressed
guidance
strong
were central
emotions were
parts of the
sometimes
image
met with
audiences
correction
saw on
instead of
Braxton
comfort.
family values.
Calm down.
She was often portrayed
Handle it
as the calm
differently.
voice encouraging her
Don't
daughters
embarrass
to
the
reconcile after arguments.
Statements like these
But
may
Tamar
sound
has
like
suggested
normal
that the
parental
private
guidance.
emotional dynamic
But
between
Tamar
them was more
suggests that
complicated
hearing
than
them
viewers
repeatedly can
realized.
send a subtle message message to a
In her
child
reflections,
that emotional
Tamar has
distress
described a
is something
relationship
that
shaped
needs to
by
be
love,
controlled rather than
respect,
understood.
and deep history,
Over
but
time,
also by
that lesson can
expectations
shape
that
the way
sometimes
someone
left her
expresses
feeling
pain.
misunderstood.
Instead of
Growing
feeling
up,
safe enough to
Tamar
share
says she
emotions
often
calmly,
felt that
they may
approval from
only
her mother
feel heard
depended
when
on
their
how well she
feelings
managed
become
her
impossible
emotions.
to ignore.
When she appeared calm, respectful, and controlled, the atmosphere in the household felt peaceful. But when her emotions became intense, the response she remembers receiving was often correction rather than comfort. Over time, Tamar says she began associating emotional expression with disapproval. That lesson can stay with someone for years. A child who learns that their feelings are inconvenient may grow into an adult who struggles to feel safe expressing those feelings calmly. The emotion doesn't disappear. It simply waits until it becomes too strong to contain. For Tamar, those moments sometimes appeared as explosive reactions that the public later witnessed on television. Looking back, she says those reactions now feel less like personality flaws and more like signals of emotional pressure that had been building for a long time. That realization didn't immediately bring peace. In fact, Tamar has hinted that it initially brought grief. Because once someone begins recognizing patterns from childhood, they often start mourning things they never realized they missed. Moments of comfort that never happened. Conversations that might have changed everything if they had occurred earlier. It's not about blaming parents for every difficulty in life. Tamar has repeatedly acknowledged that her mother worked hard to raise her children and guide them through difficult circumstances. But Tamar's reflections suggest something more nuanced. Love can exist alongside emotional misunderstandings. A parent can believe they are preparing a child for the world while unknowingly teaching that child that their emotions must always be controlled. Two things can be true at the same time. Recognizing that complexity was reportedly one of the hardest parts of Tamar's healing process. It required letting go of the idea that every family conflict needed to end with someone being completely right and someone else being completely wrong. Instead, Tamar began focusing on boundaries. Boundaries can be difficult within families, especially when the relationships have existed for decades. They require acknowledging that love does not automatically erase emotional pain. According to Tamar, creating distance from certain conversations became part of protecting her mental health. That distance wasn't about rejecting her family or refusing reconciliation. It was about stepping away from patterns that kept repeating without resolution. Sometimes the most powerful decision someone can make is to stop participating in a cycle that no longer feels healthy. For Tamar, that decision meant redefining how she interacted with the people closest to her. Instead of trying to prove that her emotions were valid, she began accepting them herself. Instead of waiting for others to acknowledge her perspective, she started trusting her own understanding of her experiences. That shift changed the way she viewed her past. Moments that once filled her with embarrassment or regret started to look different. Scenes from old episodes of Braxton family values that once made her cringe began revealing something else entirely. A younger version of herself trying desperately to be heard. The more Tamar examined those memories, the more she realized that the narrative surrounding her personality had never fully captured the emotional context behind her reactions. In her reflections, viewers had seen the eruption, but they rarely saw the pressure that came before it. That pressure included years of feeling like the child whose emotions needed fixing rather than understanding. Years of conversations where tone was corrected while hurt feelings remained unresolved. And once Tamar began naming those experiences out loud, the story surrounding her life began to shift. Her recent reflections haven't sounded like angry accusations. Instead, they often carry a tone of clarity, the kind of clarity that comes after someone spends a long time examining their past. She hasn't described her mother as a villain. She hasn't claimed that her family lacked love. What Tamar has suggested is something more complicated. That love sometimes came with expectations that made emotional expression difficult. And that
For
recognizing
Tamar,
those
those
patterns
moments
helped her
sometimes
understand
appeared as
herself
explosive
in a way
reactions
she
that
never
the
had
public
before.
later witnessed on
The
television.
biggest change wasn't how
Looking
others
back,
saw her.
she says those reactions
It was how
now
she
feel
saw
less
herself.
like personality flaws
For most
and
of
more
her
like
life,
signals of
Tamar
emotional
had been
pressure
told
that
in
had been
various
building
ways
for a long
that she was
time.
simply too emotional,
That realization
too
didn't
reactive,
immediately bring peace.
too intense.
In fact,
But
Tamar
stepping
has
back
hinted
from that
that it initially
narrative
brought
allowed
grief.
her to consider another
Because once
possibility.
someone begins recognizing
Maybe she wasn't
patterns
too
from
much.
childhood, they often
Maybe
start
she had
mourning
simply
things
spent
they
years
never
responding to
realized they missed.
situations where her
Moments
feelings
of
weren't
comfort
fully
that never
acknowledged.
happened.
That realization
Conversations that
can be
might have
incredibly
changed
powerful
everything
for
if they had
anyone
occurred
who has
earlier.
ever felt misunderstood
It's not
within their
about
own
blaming
family.
parents for every
Because
difficulty
once someone
in life.
stops believing they are the
Tamar
problem,
has
they
repeatedly
begin asking
acknowledged
different
that her mother
questions.
worked hard to raise
Instead
her
of
children
asking
and
how
guide
they
them
can
through
become
difficult
easier to deal with,
circumstances.
they begin asking
Tamar's
whether the
reflections
environment
suggest
around them
something
allowed
more
space for their
nuanced.
emotions in the first
Love can
place.
exist alongside
For
emotional
Tamar, that
misunderstandings.
shift represents the heart of
A
her
parent
story.
can believe they are
It's
preparing
not a
child
story
for the
about
world
revenge
while
or
unknowingly
exposing
teaching
secrets.
that child that their emotions
It's a story
must
about
always be
recognizing
controlled.
patterns that
Two
shaped her
things can be
identity
true
and
at the same
deciding how
time.
much power those patterns will
Recognizing
continue
that
to have
complexity
over her life.
was reportedly one of the
And
hardest
perhaps
parts
the
of
most
Tamar's
important
healing
part of that
process.
journey is the
It
understanding
required
that
letting
healing
go of
doesn't
the
always
idea
look like
that every family
reconciliation.
conflict needed to end
Sometimes
with
it
someone
looks
being
like
completely
peace.
right and someone
Quiet
else
peace.
being completely wrong.
The kind that comes from
Instead,
finally understanding
Tamar
your
began
own
focusing
story,
on boundaries.
even if not everyone else
Boundaries
agrees
can
with
be
the version
difficult
you've
within
discovered.
families, especially
Because
when
in
the
the end,
relationships have
Tamar
existed for
Braxton's
decades.
reflections leave one
They
powerful
require
question
acknowledging
hanging in the
that
air.
love does not
For
automatically
years,
erase
she was
emotional
labeled the
pain.
emotional one.
According to Tamar,
But what if those
creating
emotions were
distance
never
from
the real
certain
problem?
conversations became
What if
part
they
of
were simply the
protecting her
loudest
mental
signals
health?
of pain that had
That
been
distance
quietly
wasn't
waiting
about
for someone to
rejecting her
listen?
family or refusing
After hearing Tamar's
reconciliation.
reflections, the
It was about
conversation
stepping away
becomes a
from
lot more
patterns that
complicated
kept
than the
repeating
headlines
without
ever made it
resolution.
seem.
Sometimes
Family
the most
relationships
powerful
are rarely
decision someone
simple,
can make is to
especially
stop
when love,
participating in a
discipline,
cycle that no longer
expectations,
feels
and
healthy.
emotional wounds all exist in the
Tamar,
same
that
space.
decision meant redefining
For
how
years,
she interacted
many
with the
viewers
people
believed they
closest to her.
understood what they were watching
Instead
whenever
of trying
Tamar
to prove
Braxton
that her
reacted
emotions were
strongly
valid,
on
she
Braxton
began
family
accepting
values.
them herself.
But now that she's
Instead of
speaking
waiting
about
for
those
others to acknowledge
experiences
her
with distance
perspective,
and reflection,
she started
some
trusting
people
her
are
own
beginning to see
understanding of
those
her
moments in a
experiences.
completely different light.
That shift changed the way
So now
she
the
viewed her
question
past.
turns to you.
Moments
Do
that
you think
once filled
Tamar
her
may
with
have been misunderstood for years?
embarrassment or regret
Do you
started to
believe
look
some of the
different?
emotional reactions
Scenes
viewers
from
saw
old
were
episodes of
responses to
Braxton
deeper family
values
dynamics that
once
weren't
made her
visible on
cringe
camera?
began revealing something
Or do you
else
think the
entirely?
situation
A
simply
younger
reflects the
version of
complicated
herself,
reality
trying
of
desperately
growing
to be
up in a
heard?
strict household led
The more
by
Tamar
someone like
examined
Evelyn
those
Braxton?
memories, the more she
Share your
realized
thoughts in
that
the comments
narrative
below,
surrounding her
because
personality
conversations
had
like
never
this
fully
often reveal
captured the
perspectives
emotional
people
context
never
behind
considered
her
before.
reactions.
If you enjoy
Viewers
deep
had
dives
seen the
into
eruption,
celebrity
rarely
stories
saw the
that go
pressure
beyond
that came
surface level
before it.
drama, make sure
That
you like
pressure
this video
included years
and
of feeling
subscribe
like
to
the
the channel.
child whose emotions
And
needed
stay
fixing
tuned,
rather than
because there are more
understanding.
stories coming that
Years
might
of
completely
conversations
change the
where
way
tone
you
was
see your
corrected
favorite
while hurt
celebrities.
feelings remained unresolved. And once Tamar began naming those experiences out loud, the story surrounding her life began to shift. Her recent reflections haven't sounded like angry accusations. Instead, they often carry a tone of clarity, the kind of clarity that comes after someone spends a long time examining their past. She hasn't described her mother as a villain. She hasn't claimed that her family lacked love. What Tamar has suggested is something more complicated. That love sometimes came with expectations that made emotional expression difficult. And that recognizing those patterns helped her understand herself in a way she never had before. The biggest change wasn't how others saw her. It was how she saw herself. For most of her life, Tamar had been told in various ways that she was simply too emotional, too reactive, too intense. But stepping back from that narrative allowed her to consider another possibility. Maybe she wasn't too much. Maybe she had simply spent years responding to situations where her feelings weren't fully acknowledged. That realization can be incredibly powerful for anyone who has ever felt misunderstood within their own family. Because once someone stops believing they are the problem, they begin asking different questions. Instead of asking how they can become easier to deal with, they begin asking whether the environment around them allowed space for their emotions in the first place. For Tamar, that shift represents the heart of her story. It's not a story about revenge or exposing secrets. It's a story about recognizing patterns that shaped her identity and deciding how much power those patterns will continue to have over her life. And perhaps the most important part of that journey is the understanding that healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like peace. Quiet peace. The kind that comes from finally understanding your own story, even if not everyone else agrees with the version you've discovered. Because in the end, Tamar Braxton's reflections leave one powerful question hanging in the air. For years, she was labeled the emotional one. But what if those emotions were never the real problem? What if they were simply the loudest signals of pain that had been quietly waiting for someone to listen? After hearing Tamar's reflections, the conversation becomes a lot more complicated than the headlines ever made it seem. Family relationships are rarely simple, especially when love, discipline, expectations, and emotional wounds all exist in the same space. For years, many viewers believed they understood what they were watching whenever Tamar Braxton reacted strongly on Braxton family values. But now that she's speaking about those experiences with distance and reflection, some people are beginning to see those moments in a completely different light. So now the question turns to you. Do you think Tamar may have been misunderstood for years? Do you believe some of the emotional reactions viewers saw were responses to deeper family dynamics that weren't visible on camera? Or do you think the situation simply reflects the complicated reality of growing up in a strict household led by someone like Evelyn Braxton? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because conversations like this often reveal perspectives people never considered before. If you enjoy deep dives into celebrity stories that go beyond surface-level drama, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And stay tuned, because there are more stories coming that might completely change the way you see your favorite celebrities.